Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name. It was pretty primitive camping. No cell service, and we saw 2 other people there in the entire place. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail and the hood open. I don't really notice these types of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off beside her and offer to help her with her truck. Normally, my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone, but he said she skeeved him out enough that he didn't even want to draw her attention more than what was necessary. The next person we saw drove by several times while we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice that though until my boyfriend pointed out that he'd already done it twice. Whether these 2 people had anything sinister going on or not, the real story has to do with what woke us up at around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't describe it or even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using some large tool to scrape gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again, and again, and it was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me that because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point, he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered for me just to go back to sleep. However, I couldn't, because every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone sneaking up to the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon, or close to it, so we didn't need a light. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we went to sleep around 10 p.m., and neither of us even brought any beer. Thankfully, we got out of there, and for the rest of that trip, we either camped in areas well populated by other campers, or we got a hotel room. So whoever, or whatever that was, let's never meet. So for this one, a little background. I worked summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys in the same lake this summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to this site and set up our tents. Me and my counselor, Mike, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed and me and Mike are just shooting the crap by the water smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters, where we're responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we're camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisp of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly, crapping myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and she had to leave. "That's good. Just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where crap started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey, Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss, and saw a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We'd moved from Calgary to Toronto, and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So, when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping or fishing, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in the area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the crap, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment, listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I'd seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty much harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog, but what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled. "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone look that scared. I never want to see that expression on someone's face again, so I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look at the tent flap, to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like crap, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms length away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy, if the making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to screw off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you screw off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "Seriously, screw off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't screw off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. Sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then, we hightailed it out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we're both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We really haven't ever talked about it since that day. So, there you go. There's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes, I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but it seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. Guess I'll never know. and for that, I'm kind of glad. I posted this as a reply to a question and was told you guys may enjoy it, so enjoy hearing about one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we want to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to Harrisburg and Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We'd planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike, but our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you're supposed to camp on the trail or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore the suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around and we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, and talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoke by my girlfriend shaking me awake and telling me, "Get your gun! Someone's outside walking around our tent!" She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and then we sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Snap. Crunch. Snap. Someone, or something, walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away so as not to give away that I was out of the tent and to have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, snap, crunch, crack. It sounded like it was a bipedal based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like someone running away through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I'm giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning, I looked around a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft moist dirt not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911 and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I woke sometime later that night to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out to them something along the lines of, "We are armed! Get the hell out of here!" They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn, and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby, and I walked to the edge, where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then, I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could, and that we were leaving. Now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people taking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere and quite literally on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we'd been out there. I really felt we were in serious danger. We'd been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step out onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a sec and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were, or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone just messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I will never know, because I will not be returning to find out. Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that made it tradition to go camping at a certain spot every May-long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area right on the edge of a large lake, and it was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it, so during May-long, the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were spaced far enough apart that you could have your own privacy, but not far enough that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. During the second day, the people staying at the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it, and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At about around midnight, the people at the campsite below us were really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and he came back to inform us that he was 90% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so I just decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben, and one couple, Lily and Derek, that were visiting another campsite we had made friends with that day. I could hear that the campsite below was still blasting their music and partying pretty hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat of a blur. All I know is that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest, people were running around and screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed of what happened. Apparently, not long after I had gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up, they had encountered the Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are about the same height and have the same color hair, so they assumed that Derek was Ben and bottled both him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife, and the other had a butcher's knife in their hands. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them, and had barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming and came down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over half an hour away. This is where I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of the car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until an ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to their campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I had gotten to his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed, where they got stuck in a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs, and possibly one person had a concussion, but I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing I've ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. Hey, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you have any stories of your own that you'd like to submit, check the description and send them to my email. I hope you all have a blessed night, and be safe out there.